It's been almost 2 years since Nigeria's landmark Petroleum Industry Act was passed. How impactful has this landmark piece of legislation been, and can the sector contribute to turning around Nigeria's economic fortunes? Which aspects of the new governance structures and institutions of the Nnpc Limited and others are likely to have the biggest impact on the way the industry is run, operated, and managed, particularly the upstream segment? And is there potential for the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation to compete on the global stage with the likes of Saudi Aramco, Petronas, or even Qatar Petroleum in terms of technical expertise, geographic footprint, and financial depth and capacity? How does the future of the environmental, social, and governance dynamic look? And will Nigeria's oil and gas production recover? Well, on the sidelines of an event held by AfriSon's Pan-African Business Transformation and Strategy Consultants and titled The PIA, The Journey So Far, in collaboration with New Cross, I interviewed Bolaji Ogundare, Group Executive Director for Corporate Strategy at New Cross and Pan-Ocean Oil Corporation Group, who gives us an operator's view on these industry dynamics. Take a listen.
When I think of that, the bill and subsequently the act, you're beginning to see transformational acts take place. In fact, I think tomorrow is going to be a landmark event where Nnpc, as we have known it, will cease to exist, and it will now be a private company in essence, which is part of what the act does speculate. But you look at the governance of that structure is something that I think makes them more investment committed as an organization. But what is also very important is the regulatory aspect. And if you know, while we had the DPR before, it's been so important to separate the upstream sector and the downstream sector with very strong leaders that we have in those areas. And so you have the upstream, NUPLC, NMDRA for the midstream, with very strong administrators who are clearly defining the path for the organization. As we've always said as operators, what is really most important for us is create an enabling environment, create the regulations for us, define the fiscal regimes, and these are clearly best defined in this PIA that we have right now in Nigeria.
Now you've talked about operators. How do you think the PIA actually positions mostly indigenous oil and gas companies in the industry? Because the local community actually still accounts for a smaller share of production than, say, the big majors.
Right.
But we know that over the years, many of them have been exiting their assets and selling. So what specifically does this act do to position companies like yourself to scale in the sector?
Right. I think one of the things that this PIA really does is it encourages, better still, discourages operators acquiring assets and not working those assets. So really what the PIA has done now is define that if there's a period where you're not working those assets, then they have a right to also engage you and allow somebody else to prospect for hydrocarbon opportunities within the same asset as we know it. But the most important part that I think is when you look at it, this PIA has created an enabling environment for indigenous participation in the energy sector. And I like us to think of it pure, even from an energy sector, not just the exploration and production of oil. The PIA has created an opportunity for people to come into the midstream sector, movement of crude oil, processing, providing equipment that are used. It's such a major part of the industry. The services related, the technical services related, we're seeing increasing indigenous participation. And these are all enablements from the PIA. So, I think recently we had a marginal field bid round. I haven't seen such excitement within the indigenous exploration companies as I've seen in the last 2 years in Nigeria. There's a lot to do, but the fact that people are engaging on this, I think is really great.
Yeah, it's great. People often talk about the fact that Nigeria has a highly skilled energy sector. There are many of our engineers and geologists and technicians and professionals who are working across the global oil and gas sector. So this certainly creates that hope and prospect that things will improve. But if we peel back the layers around the governance institutions, the legal structures, the specifics of the regulatory framework, what aspects of that governance structure, the new proposed governance structure, are you as an industry operator most excited by?
So, one of the areas where I really think is exciting is delineating the role of, as in my role, the NUPLC from the Office of the Minister, from the Office of the Minister of State. So one of the things that this act has in particular done is It identifies the petroleum minister, the minister of state, but NUPRC, and it gives significant authority to an organization, which is the authority, that is in principle not politically elected. So this also allows for continuity. For example, the right to extend licenses is now with NUPRC, which I think is very important. It also helps the bureaucracy of the process. I mean, when you think about it in the past, the minister was in charge of regulations. He was in charge of policies. He was in charge of approving license extensions and all areas. Now, a bit of that responsibility has been taken off him, or her, which I think is really good, and then embedded in another organization, which has also been set up, at least for now, with very good professionals that are well known and conversant with the industry. So I think from that area, there is more clarity on how the governance of the upstream industry is going to operate. I mean, for example, right now, they've been very specific about those who are converting to the new PIA terms. And NUPRC is actively seeking engagement with the oil and gas producers, with either the OPTS organizations or the IPPG, which is the Independent Petroleum Producers Group. They're seeking our input as they're making decisions that will ultimately govern the industry. And I think that is really very good.
Yeah, and of course, consensus building is never a bad thing in the industry. Now, one of the big changes that trailed the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act was Nnpc as a national oil company. We know that many oil and gas companies have actually been rebranding themselves. So it was interesting to see the main national oil company also rebrand, change its logo from Energy for Today, Energy for Tomorrow, and then become a limited company. Now, if you look at globally, national oil companies like Saudi Aramco or Petronas, do you see an Nnpc Limited being able to compete with those sort of global peers in terms of global footprints, technical expertise, production potential? What are your thoughts?
I mean, if I worked in Nnpc today, I'll be very excited. Why do I say this? They've literally made it a private organization that can have a proper governance structure, that can raise financing to explore all basins within Nigeria and, if possible, outside Nigeria. But more interestingly, they've also basically enabled Nnpc to look at the midstream sector and the downstream sector. In the last 1 or 2 years, and you will see those steps from Nnpc, they're really looking at the refinery processes. They're looking at raising finances from international organizations, both within and outside Nigeria. These are things where, so basically, they're doing it on their balance sheets at this point, and they should be doing it on their balance sheet rather than on the national treasury, which further enables them to grow as an organization. So yes, they can absolutely compete, and they can also partner indigenous companies. So you would probably start finding Nnpc finding specific indigenous companies that they may say, look, we want to work with you on renewable energy, we want to work with you on biofuels, we want to work with you on petroleum products. So I think this really strengthens Nnpc to fully explore the world. Recently, I think there was the OVH transaction, which is a downstream transaction, but it essentially gives Nnpc access to gasoline stations across West Africa.
And of course, for those who may not be aware, Nnpc bought the assets of OVH.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is something that they would not have been able to do in the past. But now, as a private company, they can look at any company in Nigeria that they think, look, we want to grow inorganically in this sector. We can go in and acquire that company as long as our balance sheet can carry that.
Yeah, and of course, deep financial pockets is something that a lot of operators always wish for in this sector. And just to remind our audience to please send in your questions and your comments via the Slido platform using the event code #4282958. So, fiscal structure, that is a part of any new law or legislation that can be potentially really welcome or really controversial. And I just had a few aspects of that fiscal structure here. In the upstream sector, under the PIA, the headline rate of tax for a company in the upstream space will be 60% compared to the current rate of 85%. The PIA also effectively reduces the tax rate for companies in the deep offshore areas from 50 to 30. This, on the surface, in my mind, seems to be a step in the right direction. But based on experience, do you think we have struck the right balance between revenue generation on the one hand for Nigeria and incentives to encourage investors to invest in Nigeria?
Right. This is really exciting for someone who is proactive and clearly thinking of a mutually beneficial relationship, which is what I think the leaders and the guys who put the PIA together thought about that. How can we create a competitive landscape to compete with other regions where people are actively exploring? Don't forget, I mean, if you think about it, we're competing now with areas in the eastern part of Africa, we're competing in Southeast Asia for the same capital. So we really need to encourage investors to come here. But the way I look at what has been done is it's an opportunity to bake a bigger pie, of which you can get a smaller piece of a bigger pie rather than a bigger piece of a small pie. So by altering positively the fiscal regimes, we've created an opportunity to encourage more participation, which ultimately leads to a bigger pie. So eventually, at the end of the day, the government actually gets a lot more revenue because more people are investing in the sector.
Yeah, and so the fiscals are not the only thing that drive investment decision-making for global investors. Many people have always said that historically, subsurface risk in Nigeria is not a problem, and what they often see is the above-ground risks. So apart from the regulatory environment, it's the community relations, and we're going to come to that. It's some of the evacuation issues. So I guess as a whole, when you take the more relaxed fiscal rules, looking at it as a whole, how does the PIA address those other issues broadly?
The PIA has actually tried to proactively ensure that there is a symbiotic relationship with the host communities. Now, one of the things I always talk about is when we look at it, and we've experienced this, if a line gets damaged, if a vessel gets damaged, if an oil asset gets damaged, more often than not, it's one of two parties. It's either vandals from outside that we would think about, or people might think it's people from the host communities. More often than not, it's not people from the host communities. What the PIA now does with the host community fund is it creates a long-term sustainable relationship. And I know we're going to come to this a bit later, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But I think once the people who live above surface start to feel a sense of ownership, a sense of commitment to the asset development, there is more commitment to protecting evacuation. I mean, evacuation has been the bane of the industry for the last 10 years, and it's really a challenge for everyone.
How so? I mean, can you give maybe more concrete information around the evacuation challenge?
I mean, so I'll go specifically and just think about what we've dealt with as a country in whole. I mean, for most of last year, I believe Nnpc data came out and said we were losing probably up to 40-50%, above 40-50% of what was on the NCT Membe Creek trunk line, yeah, which is basically in the Delta. So we're losing that much. The Transfocados line was down also for a significant amount of time, less than the NCTL. And the Brass River line is also being down on and off. So when you think about this, what has been consistent in Nigeria in terms of production has been the offshore production, but most landlocked assets that have had to go through pipelines have really been restricted.
Yeah.
I mean, we see the numbers. Nigeria should be at a potential about 1.8, depending on where you're reading, or 2 million barrels a day, and we're doing sometimes 1.2, 1.4 million.
Yeah, I mean that's been a concern. We've all seen the headlines. You heard about the pipelines, the Focados, the Escravos. Now, the petroleum industry bill has stipulated that players in the sector need to form different companies in order to operate the assets. Now, companies have different business models and structures for different purposes, legal purposes, tax efficiency purposes. Do you see that as a great incentive for you? I mean, what implications does it have for mostly indigenous oil companies who are trying to mirror that sort of integrated oil and gas approach?
No, I think it enables a different sector of the industry to grow. The upstream mindset, I've always told you, the upstream mindset differs from the midstream mindset or from the downstream mindset. And this allows, if you think about it in the past, an oil and gas company that is focused primarily on exploration and production is also responsible for its own evacuation pipeline. So it builds it, it operates it, it maintains it, and it secures it. That in itself is bringing up an upstream and a midstream company, which is doing that. What I think this does is it allows for an independently operating midstream company that is in charge of the pipeline. So the upstream companies spin off their their oil evacuation lines, so that a different company is responsible for that, and they can focus on core exploration and production activities. Also for gas commercialization, when you think about a lot of upstream companies, they have a gas plant. The concept of them working under the same company as a whole is actually quite, it limits growth. From my experience, upstream operators tend to move very slow in decision making. It takes us a while to make final investment decisions, to decide literally anything, because when we move, we have to move with big numbers. For a downstream operator or someone who's operating a gas plant, price dynamics changes every day. A cargo lands at the port, you need to adjust your prices. So that reaction is something that is not inbuilt in an upstream company. So, and that's why I always say sometimes by having this, it allows for a specialized, actually a split of the specialization or of the oil and gas sector.
So certainly we can expect to see some efficiencies in the way companies operate in the sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And one other type of efficiency people are potentially excited about is the possibility for the joint ventures to become incorporated. We've heard the examples about the cash call obligations on Nnpc's dependency on federal accounts, and the cash squeeze that the government has been facing, and then the delay that causes to the partnerships and the ability to develop assets and bring them online. Are you optimistic about the concept of incorporated joint ventures?
I am extremely optimistic about the concept. I also have concerns about it, but I think the concerns can be easily solved. The biggest limitation we have in the energy sector in Nigeria is access to capital because of our financial sector has really tried very hard and they've done some really landmark transactions in the last few years. But we've also seen the impact of those transactions on the balance books of those banks. So ultimately, this comes to what I think would enable this is an increase in access to finance by organizations that have an African context to them. So which means we're looking at financing upstream activities, midstream activities, downstream activities from an African perspective. So absolutely, yes. Okay.
And I guess the access to capital is key. One of the things that we've seen with the midstream and gas reforms within the PIA is that the government has created a midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund to promote investments into the sector where companies can contribute part of their operating expenditure. I believe, that's for the communities fund. But what exactly is the requirement for funding and financing? If you were to size, in a sense, the requirements around gas infrastructure and what it would take to really develop and consolidate our infrastructure network in the gas sector, what is your thinking on how big that need would be?
What I would tell you is relatively is more than what we used to develop oil and gas. And I'll tell you this, oil production is a lot easier when you don't do it responsibly. In the sense that you produce your oil, you flare your gas. And there's a reason people have traditionally flared gas, because it's a lot more expensive and it's a lot more cumbersome to process it. But it's clearly what is more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. So what is it going to take is clear. I think about this from the point of, it still comes down to being able to finance the gas sector, because it takes a lot more commitment. Also, I think the PIA has addressed this by reducing the tax regimes around gas operations. This was an enabler by the PIA to encourage people to invest in gas infrastructure. And it's now up to the operators or the entrepreneurs, for lack of a better word, to come in and take advantage of that opportunity. But financing is still a bit of a challenge because there is limited capital access within the country.
And is gas something that New Cross or Pan Ocean is looking at?
This is something that we're actually very excited about. A few years ago, being about 10 years ago, we got into an exploration activity on an asset, and we found predominantly gas and oil. Predominantly gas and not as much oil. And I think some people actually put their hands on their head and, oh my God, this is horrible. But today we find out it's not. And within our organization, we actually have a gas strategy unit, people who think only of gas. They don't even think about the oil, and they're thinking of the company growth just based on gas. And I think that mindset is beginning to change even across the country, where people are, you'll hear people talk about, in the past they'll talk of Nigeria as an oil country with gas, but the mindset is changed. People are now saying we're a gas country with oil, but we've adopted this mantra a long time ago.
And it's very interesting you mentioned that, because of course, again, in the past, when people found more gas, it was kind of like not the best type of outcome or results. Now, the hope is that the PIA actually makes operators excited about discovering gas in equal quantities or even in more quantities than oil. But there's an aspect of the PIA I wanted to touch on, probably some might deem a bit controversial, and this is around the subsidy removal. There's a part of it that talks about the downstream, the full deregulation of the downstream. And I know New Cross Pan-Ocean is not in the downstream, but I thought it would be important to hear your thoughts because the industry is interconnected. Are you optimistic? And maybe optimistic is not the right word, because I presume you're supporting deregulation, but do you see the possibility of Nigeria truly deregulating the downstream market? And if so, what would the benefits be?
For us to be a sustainable country and a sustainable nation and provide for our people, we need to deregulate gasoline. And I say this from two perspectives. One is the fact that the refining capacity currently in the country is minimal, so we can actually not service that sector. But what is also important is the landing cost, from what I gather, for refined petroleum products is a lot higher than what it's being sold for at the pump. The sad part about it is majority of those who benefit from this price at the pump are not the middle class or even the lower class. They're mostly the upper class members of society who have 10, 20 cars in there. But what is important before we focus on full deregulation is provide a sustainable public transport mechanism for majority of the people. If there is a safe, sustainable public transport system that you trust, then I believe it's okay to fully regulate the sector.
And indeed, and the point about the public transport system then brings us to this domain about different energy sources, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I know you're a big proponent of alternative energy and opportunities to reduce carbon emissions. But we are going to, first of all, take a break around the issue of community relations and ESG. In a world where globally environmental, social, and governance requirements are deepening, do you think that the PIA sets the right level of contributions from oil companies' operating expenditures to contribute 3% to this host community fund? Or do you think we're just scratching the surface of that need?
Why I think it's important that we do things that are sustainable rather than setting high limits is because each community is going to need different things. What I think the 3% starts to do is do a needs assessment community by community. And I'll give an example. If you're somewhere around Bonny community, which has been invested heavily into, the needs assessment may be less than a riverine community that is further out and has not actually had power for a long time. And each community needs different things. So one of the things I've said is when people were talking, should it be 3%, should it be 5%? I'm like, let's consistently do 3% and measure the impact of that 3%. And if we find that more is needed, then there clearly should be a path to increase that. But whether it's 3% or 5%, to be honest, is a bit arbitrary, because people have just guessed it should be 3%, it should be 5%. Let's measure 3% of an operating budget, expend it appropriately on a needs assessment of what that community needs, and measure the impact. Then we'll decide, okay, you know what, we need to increase this to 5, we need to reduce this to 2. It probably wouldn't go down.
Yeah, it's not likely to go down.
It's not going to go down.
Yeah, but I think you make a good point, because companies still have their own community development programs that they do. So there could potentially be more money, but at least you start with some consistent level of investment. Now, how confident are you that the funds will be appropriated in the right way, given some of the historical concerns around governance?
Yes. At least from my experience, the NUPRC is actually doing a very deep dive into ensuring that there's proper governance around how the funds are set up and who administers the fund. I'll use an example where some of our host communities nominated people and NUPRC was not basically look for criteria, increase the criteria for basically ask for more due diligence on those who were going to sit on this committee. I think this is a step in the right direction. What I always tell people is, let's just get into it and practicalize it and make sure we have good governance and we learn from it. This is a trial of something that we all believe will work. So we'll learn from it.
Well, that's all we have for you this week on Business Week. If you'd like to continue the conversation online, find me on X, and I'll see you next week. I'm Rolake Akinkubefelani. Take care.